the beginning of 2021. We've been studying through the book of Joshua, and today we're going to talk about Joshua's chapters 11 and 12. So we'll be turning to Joshua 11 right now. But we feel now more than ever that we are on the edge of something. We are on the edge of some new era, right? We are about to have a presidential inauguration next week. We've obviously during the last year have had COVID related issues that have changed the way that we do basically everything that we do in our lives. Technology is constantly advancing, and so these factors and other factors come together to help us to feel like the world is changing so rapidly that we cannot keep up, and that we're entering into some new era that maybe we're not prepared to contend with. We are, in other words, afraid of what might be, of what the future might hold. But we are, on the edge of some new era, and there are great things happening, as there have been in every era of history. But we don't have to have a disposition of doom and gloom about all this change that we see and about all the things that we don't understand. In fact, the children of Israel found themselves in a very similar situation at the end of their conquests when they had taken the south, as we discussed last week. They had completely encircled and taken the Canaanite lands of the south, and victory is within their grasp, but there's going to be one last great battle we're going to see in chapter 11. We sometimes feel that things are falling apart, that our society is not what it once was. But I think we often lose track of what blessings we do have and what opportunities we do have to share the word. Every aspect of our lives that we enjoy, we owe to God. And all the victories that the children of Israel had experienced up to this point in the book of Joshua, they also owed to God. Let's use the things that God has given us to tell the story of how we've been brought into the promised land by a great and mighty God. So, with that in mind, let's begin by looking at Joshua chapter 11, and we'll read through that, and we'll make some observations, and then we'll read chapter 12 and make a few observations there, and then the lesson will be yours. And then in the next couple of weeks, I'm going to attempt to do something kind of ambitious, but we'll see how it goes. I'm going to try to cover the entire rest of the book of Joshua in 2 lessons. Because there's going to be about 7 or 8 chapters after this point that are going to be about the division of the land. So we'll try to cover that all in one go, and then Joshua's remarks to the people of Israel at the end of the book we'll cover. So this week, looking at chapter 11, the conquest of northern Canaan. We can think about this as a complete victory in the north in chapter 11. So let's read. Beginning in verse 1, chapter 11. When Jabin, king of Hazor, heard of this, he sent to Jobab, the king of Madon, and to the king of Shimron, and to the king of Achshapah, and the kings who were in the northern hill country, and in the Arabah, south of Sineroth, and in the lowland, in Nephoth Dor in the west, to the Canaanites in the east and the west, the Amorites, the Hittites, the Perizzites, and the Jebusites in the hill country, and the Hivites under the Himron, the Hivites under Himron in the land of Mitzpah. And they came out with all their troops, a great horde, in number like the sand that is on the seashore, with very many horses and chariots. And all these kings joined their forces and came and encamped together at the waters of Merom to fight against Israel. And the Lord said to Joshua, "Do not be afraid of them, for tomorrow at this time I will give over all of them, slain, to Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire." So Joshua and all his warriors came suddenly against them by the waters of Merom and struck and fell upon them. And the Lord gave them into the hand of Israel, who struck them and chased them as far as Great Sidon and Mesripoth Maim, and eastward as far as the valley of Mizpah. And they struck them until he left none remaining. And Joshua did to them just as the Lord had said to him. He hamstrung their horses and burned their chariots with fire. And Joshua turned back at that time and captured Hazor and struck its king with the sword, for Hazor formerly was the head of all those kingdoms. And they struck with the sword all who were in it, devoting them to destruction. There was none left that breathed. And he burned Hazor with fire, and all the cities of those kings, and all their kings Joshua captured, and struck them with the edge of the sword, devoting them to destruction, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. But none of the cities that stood on the mounds did Israel burn, except Hazor alone, that Joshua burned. And all the spoil of these cities and livestock, and the people of Israel took for their plunder. But every person they struck with the edge of the sword until they had destroyed them, and they did not leave any who breathed. Just as the Lord had commanded Moses his servant, so Moses commanded Joshua, and so Joshua did. He left nothing undone in all that the Lord had commanded Moses. So Joshua took all that land, the hill country and all the Negeb, and all the land of Goshen, and the lowland, and the Arabah, and the hill country of Israel and its lowland, from Mount Halak, who rises toward Seir, as far as Baalgad, in the valley of Lebanon, below Mount Hermon. And he captured all their kings and struck them and put them to death. Joshua made war a long time with those kings. There was not a city that made peace with the people of Israel except for the Hivites, the inhabitants of Gibeon. They took them all in battle, for it was the Lord's doing to harden their hearts, that they should come against Israel in battle, in order that they should be devoted to destruction and should receive no mercy, but be destroyed, just as the Lord commanded Moses. And Joshua came at that time and cut off the Anakim from the hill country, and from Hebron, from Debir, from Anab, and from all the hill country of Judah, and from the hill country of Israel. Joshua devoted them to destruction with their cities. There was none of the Anakim left in that land of the people of Israel. Only in Gaza, in Gath, and Ashdod did some remain. So Joshua took the whole land according to all that the Lord had spoken to Moses. And Joshua gave it for an inheritance to Israel according to their tribal allotments. And the land had rest from war. All right. So let's make a few notes here on chapter 11. So the first thing that I think we notice, and it's been a recurring theme through the book of Joshua, is that at every victory, the enemies mount again to contend with the people of God. The enemies of God are now, in chapter 11, as numerous as the sand of the seashore. As the children of Israel grow closer and closer to fully occupying, fully taking the land, the enemies of God grow more and more desperate, more and more determined. And these alliances get wider and wider, and the enemies get more desperate. Here it says the enemies of Israel numbered as many as the seashore. So if you will remember back in Genesis, God, and we've been talking about this in our Romans class as well, God promised Abraham that his descendants would be as many as the seashore. And of course, God ultimately brings that to fruition across time, and ultimately brings all of us into the promises of Abraham as well through Christ. But in this moment, when the children of Israel are about to take the land that God promised to Abraham all those years ago, the forces that struggle against them are exactly as numerous as what God promised Abraham his descendants would be. And so it would be easy for the children of Israel to look at these opponents, to look at these enemies and be overwhelmed. that this is as many as the sand of the seashore. This is how intense the opposition to the will of God is in the world, and this is how intense the opposition to the cause of Christ will be in our lives, especially when we are very close to the victory that God is trying to give us. When the victory that we strive for is within our grasp, this is when Satan will throw everything that he can in our path. So, what do we do when the combined forces of the world and the flesh and Satan conspire against us? The answer is reflection on the assurances that God has given. And we see this in verses 6 through 9. We see victory over fear. The Lord says to Joshua, as he said to Joshua repeatedly through this book, do not be afraid of them. For tomorrow at this time I will give over all of them slain to Israel. You shall hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire. This army was great because they had horses and chariots. And God says he's going to give Joshua power over them. This idea of hamstringing the horses meant to cut a tendon in the horse's leg so that they would not be useful for military purposes anymore. It wouldn't kill the horse. The horse could still do agricultural labor, but they could not run with the speed and the swiftness that you need in military use. And of course, the chariots would be burned with fire. And so God says, I'm going to give the victory to you tomorrow. I will deliver these people to you slain. And so that's exactly what God accomplishes. Joshua and all his warriors come against them swiftly, and the Lord gives them into their hand, and he chases them as far as Sidon and Mitzropoth Maim, I think is the correct pronunciation of that. I'm not a Hebrew scholar, as you can tell. But there is a great pursuit here that ensues following this victory that Joshua gets over the enemies. And he does, in verse 9, hamstring their horses and burn their chariots with fire, just as God had promised. And so when we are afraid, when we look at the enemy and we don't know how we're going to overcome, it's then that God tells us to put aside our fear and to trust in him and what he has promised us and what he has said he will do for us. I think it's so interesting the number of times that God tells Joshua not to be afraid. And I talked about it in the beginning of this series when we talked about God's call to Joshua, God's commission for Joshua. And I think it's important to reiterate, God knows how afraid we are, how prone to fear we are. And so God constantly gives us reassurance. God constantly reminds us of his promises so that we will put aside fear and lean into faith, lean into trust in what he has promised us. And then in verses 10 through 15, we see an example made of the city of Hazor. We see Hazor is burned. The other cities that are set on mounds are not burned. And so again, this is an idea that we've discussed already in this study, but it is that the children of Israel are going to take most of these cities and reappropriate them for their own. But Hazor, because Hazor, it's noted, led this alliance of cities in the north against Israel. We see that, trying to find it. Yes, we in verse 12, all the cities of these kings and all their kings Joshua captured and struck with the edge of the sword, devoting them to destruction, just as Moses, the servant of the Lord, had commanded. But none of the cities that stood on the mountains did Israel burn, except Hazor alone that Joshua burned. And all the spoil of these cities and the livestock and the people of Israel took for plunder. In verse 10, we see that Hazor had been head of all these kingdoms. And so an example is made of this city. If you lead the rebellion against God, you will be made an example of. This is the lesson that is taught innately to the children of Israel and to everyone who witnesses these things. And so for us, a good way for us to relieve ourselves of the fear that we sometimes have of the power of Satan is to remember that he, as a leader of the rebellion against God, is doomed to destruction and marked for defeat and humiliation. He will fail in all his efforts, and he will fail spectacularly. There will be nothing left of Satan and his schemes and his wiles when the Lord makes everything right. So Hazor becomes a picture of those who would attempt to marshal the forces of darkness against the will of God. And what Joshua does to Hazor, Christ will do to all in the last day, all such people, and all those who would marshal the forces of darkness against the powers of Christ, who beset the cause of Christ. They will be dealt with finally in the last day. So it's important for us to take note that there was a great deal of material and a great deal of benefit salvaged from these cities. And so this destruction is not something where God is wantonly rejoicing in this destruction, but rather he is making an example of those who would lead a rebellion against his will. And so this applies spiritually for us in our struggles against Satan. God will ultimately make an example of the one who tempts and the one who tests us. But keeping in mind our ultimate victory over Satan, we have to remember as well that God is in control of all of this, and it's only through God's power that this victory is brought about in Joshua. And this has been the case with all of the battles that Joshua has fought. God's control over his plan. And God's plan here is long in terms of time, right? We're going to touch on this a little bit at the end of the lesson, but it's been a long time, many years of fighting that this has been going on. The campaign that the children of Israel have been waging has taken a toll. From the Exodus to this point, why were the children of Israel held back? Why were they hindered? Why did it take so long? Well, specifically, there was a lack of faith related to God's power to deliver initially that caused them to wander in the wilderness for 40 years. And it's the same for us often. We don't always see God's plan in the big picture. We very rarely do, in fact. We certainly can't find our own way into the promised land. But the most certain way to stay out of the promised land is to say it can't be done. That's what those spies said when they spied out the land and they saw that the people were great. They said that the people are great and we are like grasshoppers in their sight. There's nothing that God can't do, and this whole book proves that. This small people has been given full dominion and full victory over the people of this land that they were so afraid of. God's plan sometimes takes time to unfold. God's plan sometimes depends on God's perspective, not ours, which means that we sometimes don't understand. We cannot see everything that God has in mind. But it's then when we need to lean the most on God, when we need to trust in what he has promised us, that he will give us the victory. He is in control of everything. So when we're dismayed about what's going on in this country, when we're dismayed about what's going on in the world, when we are afraid of what's going to happen next, we need to remember that God has a plan. He's in control, and he's working his plan over time. And finally, we see in verses 21 through 23 of chapter 11, the Anakim, these great giants that we heard about way back when the spies were sent out. It was these giants that scared those spies, with the exception of Joshua and Caleb. This was the reason that they had to wander in the wilderness. But it's interesting to note, we heard so much about these, and this was the reason why there was 40 years of wandering in the wilderness. But when the time comes to fight, here in Joshua chapter 11, to fight with these giants, it's a footnote. It's barely mentioned, right? There's no real details, only that that the Anakim are devoted to destruction in their cities, except for some in Gaza, in Gath, and Ashdod. And it's actually from Gath where Goliath is going to come later, and he many scholars think is a descendant of one of these Anakim that lived in the cities of the Philistines. But um, these giants that were so terrifying to the children of Israel are defeated easily by the power of God. And isn't that the way it often goes with us? We make our own giants in our mind, and we think we can't fight them. We think we are not strong enough to contend with the giants that want to rule over us, want to rule over the land of our hearts. And we are wrong when we think we cannot fight these giants. We do not know what we're capable of. Only God does. And with God's power, we can vanquish giants. I like to think that it's possible that as David was preparing to go to battle with his great showdown with Goliath, he had a couple of these verses in his head about God giving Joshua the victory over the Anakim. That with the power of God, even the most fearful of opponents can be easily defeated. I think that's a lesson that it's important for us to remember today. With that in mind, when we look over at at chapter 12 of Joshua, we see a summarized account of the entire campaign of the children of Israel to arrive at the promised land from their exodus from Egypt. So we first in verses 1 through in verses 1 through 6 get a recounting of Moses and his victories that he won. And we won't read through all of this because it's a lot of names and it's repetitive. But I think it's important to note here in verse 2, Sihon, king of the Amorites, who lived at Heshbon and ruled from Aroer. And then in verse 4, Og, king of Bashan, one of the remnant of the Rephaim, who lived at Ashtoreth and at, and at Edrei, and ruled over Mount Hermon and Selica and all Bashan to the country of the Gershuites and the Maccathites. And so we get a description of these two kings who we have an account way back in the law of Moses about their defeat. And remember the arc of this journey that the children of Israel have taken, right? Remember that not that long before, these people who are now occupying the land were slaves in Egypt. So when they were slaves in Egypt, who would have bet on them to possess this land when they left Egypt? Who would have thought that they could defeat kings with armies that were trained, even though it was they left Egypt, this ragtag army of slaves who were untrained. But Moses defeated Sihon and Og. And if you remember that story, it's because Moses lifted his hands to God and his hands were held up by the elders of Israel. And it sets the precedent that Israel can only fight her enemies when her leader is seeking after God and interceding in prayer on behalf of the people. Think about it. The hands up were a sign of prayer in the ancient world. Moses is praying, he's interceding for the people. We know that the prayer of a righteous man can avail much. But even Moses, in his fleshly body, his failing earthly form, he can't hold his hands up forever, right? And the battle takes a long time. And so those underneath him, those who serve him, those who lead the tribes of Israel, they hold up his hands. And so we our today leadership is important. It's important that our leaders look to God constantly for guidance, and this is true in our churches, this is true in our nation, this is true in our local communities. But we must also do our part to lift up their hands, to support them, to give them strength as they lead. And we see that even as great a leader as Moses was, after Moses' work is done, the work is not even begun. The land still needs to be occupied when Moses dies. And so this is Joshua's role. And we see that in the second half of chapter 12. In chapter 12, verses 7 through 23, we see a list of the kings that Joshua has defeated. And in verse 24, we finally get the final tally of all these kings defeated, and it's 31 kings that Joshua defeats in his conquest of the land. So we've already observed how Joshua fully encircled and conquered the south, and today we've seen his conquest of the north. So Joshua, with God's help, became one of the greatest military conquerors and the greatest leaders who've ever lived. He took this land with an army of people who had no rights by the laws that govern military conflict typically to take this land, but by the power of God, they took it. But something important to note here that we saw with Moses, when Moses died, there was more work to be done. And when Joshua dies, there'll be more work to be done. To foreshadow ahead at the beginning of chapter 13, there are many areas of the promised land that have not been fully occupied, and in which there are still these people who are going to become a thorn in the side of the children of Israel. And yet, we are told that Joshua did all that the Lord commanded. We're told in 13 that it's because Joshua is old and he hasn't gotten done everything that he needs to get done. So I think this answers questions, or it at least leads us toward answers to questions that we ask a lot of the time about obedience versus faith, obedience versus trust. Of course, we have to obey God. Of course, we see a pattern of obedience across the entire Scripture. We've noted this in the story of Abraham, and we see this consistently throughout the Bible. We saw it in Moses, and we see it in Joshua. But when Joshua was old and ready to die, there was still work to be done. And so, do we have to obey God? Yes, of course we do. And if we do that, if we spend our lives striving after following in the ways of God, will there be work left undone at the end of our lives? Of course there will be. This is why our salvation relies on grace and not on the work that I have done. Because I can do good work all day long for the rest of my life, and it's still not enough to pay for my fault. It's still not enough to get me into the promised land on my own. It was a big task given to Joshua by God, a life's task, a lifelong task. And our task is equally weighty, to go to all the world, baptizing everyone to believe and be baptized in Christ. And at the end of your life, there will be work left undone in that call, that calling that we all have. But you and I, we can enter into our rest with comfort, with assurance and trust that God will do all that he has purposed, both for this world, on which he is playing out this great drama of life over time, and for us personally, individually, he will do as he has purposed and as he has promised. What has he promised us? That we will find new life and be made new in him. And that one day everything that we know will be made new in him completely, finally. We will be given a true, final spiritual victory in Christ when he will vanquish all those who have opposed the work of Christ, and he will bring us to new life with him. Israel entered into the promised land. Israel found that life. Israel was made new in God when they occupied the land. And so if we occupy the person of Christ, if we occupy his character, his example, his teachings, if we make them our own, we will be made new, and our lives and the world in which we occupy will be made new around us. This is the promise of God. This is the victory we can achieve, both in this life and in the life that is beyond the veil of death. This is all I had prepared on Joshua 11 and 12, but I hope that the notes have been beneficial to you. And I think it's important, as I've been saying throughout the study of Joshua, that we keep in mind um, when we look around us in the world and we see the imperfection that is everywhere, when we see the struggles that the people of God enter into and the fights that we are engaged in, it's easy to get discouraged. It's easy to get depressed. I struggle with it all the time. But I think it's also important to note that the one who we fight for and the one who fights for us is the author of all creation. He knows where this story is going, even when we don't. Even when we despair, he offers hope, true hope, for a future where we have true life in him. If there are any who have any spiritual need, hope that you will come and make that known. And if there are any who wish to become a child of God today, we certainly encourage you to make that known now, and we will accommodate you however we can. Um, Thank you for your attention, and we'll now have the song that's been announced.